Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This is S4A Livestream number 45 being recorded on September 22, 2022. That really threw me off more than it should have. Anyway, we've got about 55 people in the chat, which is great. And we were just talking a little bit about what we're going to cover in today's stream. So I will share that now because as we get more organized with the live streams, and just as people suggest more and more topics, I'm finding I need to actually make kind of a list of what's going on in the show. I know that's kind of a normal thing for people to do. Up to this point, I've pretty much been winging it and just dumping some stuff into a folder, and that's been working. But to make sure we actually cover everything today, I actually made a list. So the CIA itself has made a podcast. They just announced it like a couple hours ago online. Unbelievable. Their first episode is out, so they're no longer just, funding other things. They're actually making their own podcast now. Bringing the agency out of the shadows, I believe, is the first thing. So anyway, we'll look at that briefly. There are protests in Iran involving the burning of hijabs, and one of the activists involved in this was brutalized by the Iranian government over it. And before you start screaming about color revolution, people, I think, are overly conditioned at this point, especially people in this sort of contrarian boat of anti-imperialism without socialism. People are sort of chomping at the bit to call every piece of social unrest color revolution. That's not the case. I mean, it's fundamental to Marxism that people struggle for their rights. They struggle against oppression. They struggle against exploitation. As Marxists, we try to guide them in the most productive ways possible. But obviously, it comes from the masses. So if you're trying to just negate every piece of social unrest as color revolution, you're doing Marxism wrong. So we're going to look at a statement from the KKE, Greek Communist Party, about that. Also, I'm on a LaRouche binge. Now that we've sort of pinned down the PatSocs thing as clearly just coming from LaRouche, as, Maupin and Infracell and Hinkston are all appearing at, LaRouche conferences, or Maupin used to when he was still welcome in polite society, or whatever society he was a part of. And, promoting LaRouche political candidates and things like that is clearly a LaRouche effort. This makes a lot of sense. And we're going to watch 4 or 5 minutes of an interview from, I think, 1986 with Lyndon LaRouche, where he explains he's not in the left and he never was leftist. In the early days when he was in the New Left and for a while in a Trotskyist group, it was pretty much to combat the left. So, PatSocs, in the left to be against the left. This is a time-honored LaRouche tradition, and you can hear it straight from the horse's mouth in that video. Somebody also mentioned, and I did want to highlight, the misogyny that is common. I mean, there's a reason we call it infracell. There's a lot of sort of excuse me, I just say that so much, incel bullshit going on there. We know that also, Instagram influencer Samira Khan is involved in this as well. She's on the ticket for the latest Schiller Institute. That's a LaRouche think tank event. We're going to see a poster for it when we get up to there. And she frequently tweets in support of toxic masculinity and the guy Andrew Tate that's like under investigation for human trafficking and stuff. So that's the kind of bullshit that people are supporting when they get into that. We're also going to finish that RBN video with Hinkman because actually there's an important thing at the end we didn't get to where they talk about the Young Patriots organization, which was in a coalition with the Black Panthers Party. Black Panther Party. It was one of those things where I was going to say Black Panthers, and then part of my brain was like, say Black Panther Party, and so both came out. Anyway. So people are trying to compare the YPO to MAGA, and that's just not even remotely a comparison anyone should make. We're going to read an article that I actually pulled for yesterday, but we didn't get around to because couldn't make it all the way through that video. We're going to hold the nose and do it. Also, we talked a little bit about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what's going on there. I gave a brief statement, which I think pretty much covered it. Somebody sent me the statement, again from the KKE, Greek communists, and it's pretty short and it's on point, so we're going to read that. Next, Joe Sims of CPUSA is a co-chair, is back on the vote against fascism thing. I made a S4A community post on the YouTube channel about that. Please just fucking stop. Anyway, we're going to talk about it, and we're going to read some criticism of Joe Sims, from, if you remember, Comrade Renee. This is the blogger who I read from a few streams ago when we were talking about Paul Cockshot's anti-LGBTQ bigotry. Renee has also written on other figures in the movement, including Joe Sims. So we're going to read some of that. Next, we were talking about Richard Wolff the other day, and there is an article that I had left over from when I did that Understanding Richard Wolff series in, I think, like May-June of 2021 last year, which had to do with Ronald Reagan's push for employee ownership, which was launched under the rubric of the Task Force for Economic Justice. He gave a speech, if you look it up, the Project for Economic Justice in 1987. So Reagan was basically pushing employee ownership, and worker co-ops are one form of that. Reagan stated he felt it could be an antidote to socialism. So there was an article I had from back in the 80s where Wolff is in debate or conversation with another person in the labor movement, talking about, is this really a good thing or not for labor? So I think that some excellent points were made against it. Somebody was talking about that basically Wolff's cooperative stuff, it's kind of petty bourgeois socialism. Now, if you look at the Communist Manifesto, that has other meanings as well. Basically, the petty bourgeoisie that thinks that they can just stay in the early phase of capitalism forever before capital really gets consolidated and the petty bourgeoisie gets wiped out, ruined by, the Amazons and Walmarts, etc. But in many ways, the cooperative thing, especially as Wolff pushes it, as to be like a non-confrontational way of forming, quote, socialist enterprises in a way that doesn't directly draw the ire of capital and doesn't directly, well, the reason it doesn't directly draw the ire of capital is because it doesn't directly confront or doesn't even really threaten capital in any way. So anyway, but it is literally petty bourgeois in that it makes business owners out of its people, which if you're doing that in the overall context of capitalism, imperialism, then you're subject to those market forces. Many socialist countries will have a cooperative sector, but you're not dealing with just pure capitalist market forces, when you're running one of those cooperatives in a socialist country. Lenin writes about this in a piece called On Cooperation, we have on the channel, about how nationalization of the land is like a key component, and he talks about the differences between the utopian cooperativists and how they were like a bunch of cranks back in the 19th century, but now actually, after the Soviet Revolution, they could actually fulfill more of the promise of cooperatives. So check that out if you're interested. And then we're going to end on some COVID stuff. I was looking for an update on BioBot because they frequently do update on Wednesday night or Thursday, at least by the afternoon, but nothing so far. So we will just recap BF7 real quick and then look at some articles about links between COVID infection and neurological damage, brain and nerve damage, as well as increased risk of neurological and neurodegenerative disorders. This came up a few streams back, and I do have a few articles on it. So anyway, that's what we're planning to talk about. Get your thoughts in now on the chat, and let's get into it. Hold me to this, by the way, because I'm really trying to figure out. I mentioned in the last stream I was trying to do one stream in the week. Clearly, we need at least two. I was doing some thinking today about whether we need 3 streams in a week or not. I sort of have Wednesday like glued down right now, and then it often spills over into Thursday. Wondering if maybe Friday would make sense as well for sort of wrap up, but yet to be decided. So anyway, This is it, just so you can see the proof, the CIA's podcast from @CIA. Tap, tap, tap. Is this thing on? The Langley Files. Hashtag CIA's official podcast. Episode 1 is now available. Listen to CIA Director William J. Burns bring the CIA out of the shadows as we celebrate our 75th year of serving the nation. You serve fucking corporate empires, that's all you do. Anyway, that is, you can see the URL there, thelangleyfiles.transistor.fm. And they have a trailer up and just published their first episode. @TwinkModin retweeted it with, the CIA is so frustrated with all of their failed attempts at astroturfing podcasts that align with their agendas that now they're just going to do it directly. This honestly should be interesting. I didn't have a chance to listen to it, but it would be interesting seed of a discussion as far as debunking it or, offering counterpoints. So the CIA wants to come out of the shadows and promote themselves. This should be a great opportunity for people who actually know more of the history of the CIA to push back on it. You could build an entire podcast about just discussing the bullshit that they promote. I mean, it's an extension of military intelligence, basically. So if you already don't like militarism, the CIA is kind of the brain of U.S. militarism, which is, of course, the major arm of world imperialism. That's the function of the USA. It's part of the reason why we don't have more social democratic programs in the U.S. They need the U.S. to be basically cannon fodder for global imperialism. And, they use the economic draft, like the only way that a lot of people who grow up in poverty, especially like in the middle of nowhere, there's no opportunities, there's not good educational opportunities. Of course, college is super expensive as well. All that stuff, it's how they get people to join the military. They don't want to use an outright, conscriptive draft because that caused them a lot of problems back in the Vietnam War days. And so the U.S. is proud to have a, quote, all-volunteer army. Well, really, it's because they keep us in crushing poverty, and people who are naive about the military get involved in it. It's not solely people who are naive about it, but a lot of people get in without realizing just how evil it is. Like, I just wanted free college. Yeah, and maybe they really didn't know better. Some don't. But anyway, yeah, this is on the scene. I'm telling you, people could build an entire show around just debunking and discussing that. So anyway, moving on next to what is going on in Iran. Where are we with this? So I have some pictures here. This is from the KKE statement. So Mahsa Amini, this is a young women's rights activist who got tired of wearing the hijab, which is mandated by the religious fashion police. And basically, this is how she ended up in the hospital after being brutalized by the Iranian police for this. So, trying to see where, there we go. KKE's statement on this, which pretty good Communist Party, KKE. This is from In Defense of Communism. You can see it down at the bottom there. ID Communism. I forget if it's .org or .com. It's one of those two. Anyway, headline, KKE, Mahsa Amini's murder is the tip of the iceberg of the blatant social discriminations against women. In a statement about the murder of 22-year-old Iranian woman Mahsa Amini and the popular mobilizations in Iran, and let's just quick, I think I have another picture of some of what was going on. So there it is, some of the burning of the hijab. Billions of women around the world don't wear a hijab, can lead entirely normal and reasonably happy lives, so this is not really something required by human biology in any way. Anyway, the press office of the CC of the Communist Party of Greece, KKE, points out, quote, "We denounce the Iranian regime for the brutal murder of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini by the religious police in the name of indecent clothing, as well as the repression against popular mobilizations. The heinous crime is the tip of the iceberg of the blatant social discriminations experienced by women in education, family, even in their clothing features, which have as a basis and starting point outdated and reactionary perceptions concerning a woman's position in society." The hypocritical declarations and sanctions by the EU, USA, and NATO officials who use such dark practices against women in the context of inter-imperialist competitions do not consist a protection shield against multifaceted violence for any woman for any woman like Amini. Sorry, I'm still on that consist. That's sort of a grammatical thing. But anyway, after all, these are the same forces that at the same time support regimes in other countries that apply the same practices against women. So Saudi Arabia, for example, the U.S. wants to talk about human rights, supports Saudi Arabia, supports Israel, genocidal apartheid state. So, okay. Anyway. The answer to obscurantism and regression at the expense of women's rights all over the world is to strengthen the front against the rotten values and the modern reaction of capitalist society. Rage and indignation toward such heinous crimes can become a force of struggle to uproot the social class root of women's unequal position in capitalism and its cultural religious envelope. So, as far as Marxist theory in support of this is, there's been a lot of right opportunist distortions of what should be supported and promoted by communists in terms of social progressiveness. But this is stated very clearly by Stalin, going back to Marxism and the National Question, about not supporting, the mullahs and the other reactionary religious elements in society. Neoliberal capitalism is not the only alternative here. It's not just like you support the U.S. or you support this. Communism offers a pro-worker, worker-centered way forward out of exploitation and oppression that is neither the theocratic, reactionary type of regime that Iran has, nor the violent and exploitative imperialism of the U.S. and EU. Communism is a way forward, which is neither of these, and we need to build a movement for that, and that's what we're trying to promote. All right. So I mentioned LaRouche. Let's get into the LaRouche video. Now, where did I put it? This is the next challenge. Oh yeah, it's not an image. That's why it's not showing up in the image. All right, let's get that back on there, and time for some media. Here we go. So this is probably going to start auto-playing, and then I'm just going to skip it ahead to
long run, who knows? But in the short run,
pause that, embiggen it. Oh, there we go. And what is the timestamp on this one? There we go, 6:47. Let's skip ahead to 6:47 and listen for a couple of minutes. I will be taking this up to where he says he hasn't been a Marxist since the 1950s. All right.
For them, knew what they were voting for.
Mr. LaRouche, I wanted to ask you something that's always puzzled me about you. I've read about you for years. And you started out in politics on the far left with the Students for the Democratic Society under the name of Lynn Marcus, I believe. You were in the Columbia University protest movement.
1968.
What caused you, and I guess you wouldn't object to being called a part of the right wing right now, would you?
Well, it depends on what they mean by that. As a conservative, American conservatism, as opposed to the European use of the term conservative, I would accept that. I'm a constitutional traditionalist.
All right,
Okay, so first of all, right there, I'm a constitutional traditionalist. That's LaRouche's stated position in the mid-'80s. He will later be asked, are you a Marxist? He says, I don't know. I'm an expert on Marx, but I don't know. And they're like, well, give me a yes or no answer. And he says no. And he also says he never agreed with Marx as an economist. So that's how Marxist this whole thing is actually. Note the lip licking here. As the clip goes on, there's an awful lot of lip licking. I'm not really sure what this is about. Just a very, very odd person, Lyndon LaRouche. There's not a lot of substance in it, but there's a spoof of LaRouche by Al Franken back on SNL, like way back in the day, that is a pretty decent impression, although the actual script, like the bit they're doing, isn't that funny, really. But yeah, so he's a constitutional traditionalist, and would you object to being called part of the right wing? No. Just, not the European right wing. Okay, because that's not really relevant. Let's continue.
But did you have a change in your whole philosophy? Was there some revelation? What happened?
No, it was just, well, first of all, the left-wing thing is exaggerated. That's where the problem starts. We actually slid into SDS, not by intent, but as a matter of tactics, because we were determined, a group of friends of mine and I, were determined to combat the new left on its home terrain and to deal with the entire left problem, because many good people were being drawn into the anti-war movement. These were people who were being drawn into this countercultural process, which SDS was part of. Therefore, we said, let's get in there, since I thought the Vietnam War was a travesty, for somewhat different reasons than the left did, but nonetheless a travesty. Let's get in there. Let's represent a positive policy on the Vietnam War question, and let's win people away from what I consider, and we consider at that point, a terrible thing.
So that's his basic position. And if you have been involved in the anti-war movement at all, this is what libertarians do. They get in there and they try to make a case for an anti-war position, which is designed to pull people away from the left. All this other stuff about the anti-countercultural stuff, which, by the way, U.S. culture, especially like from the mid-20th century, could be so stifling, the amount of conformity required, that the average person just sort of like doing what they wanted could be considered counterculture. Like, it could be very, very restrictive. So counterculture was liberating in a lot of ways. Obviously, there were excesses and unhealthy things, but there were unhealthy things in the dominant culture as well. It's sort of absurd to like try to, black sheep scapegoat counterculture for that. A lot of counterculture was just like, hey, maybe we don't need to, follow the particular traditional and just not even super traditional, but just contemporary bourgeois values that were being promoted as far as how people had to look and talk and dress, and the sort of media that they were going to create and participate in, etc. But this reminds me of the Caleb Maupin talk where he's at the neo-fascist conference next to Dugan in 2018. Anyway, so here it is. LaRouche, we're going to combat the left problem from within the left. So we entered SDS as part of the late 60s New Left movement to fight the left. We're going to go in and say, here's our anti-war, conservative anti-war statement, and we're trying to pull people deliberately out of the left because we hate the left. It was a problem and a terrible thing, quoting LaRouche here. Let's continue.
Now, there are some people who claim that even today you are an agent of the KGB, that they support your operation. And as you know, as a student of Bolshevik history, the Bolsheviks and their intelligence apparatus have supported supposedly right-wing groups, the famous Trust in Russia.
Francois Genoux, the head of the Nazi International in Switzerland, is a good example.
All right.
For the record, I'm not actually sure what he said, the interviewer guy. I'm not sure what he said, and then I'm not familiar with the name that LaRouche just mentioned. Perhaps somebody in the chat can point out what they're talking about, because I'm unfamiliar with that entirely.
And are you part of that tradition?
No, the Soviets fear me as I'm not. The Soviets fear me. There are people, apart from idiots in the street, or people out of ignorance and paranoia will suspect that. But there are people like Robert Moss and so forth who spread that nonsense. They ought to know better, because they have enough access to intelligence to know what the Soviets really think about me. The Soviets consider me, perhaps with some exaggeration, the intellectual author of the SDI, and have screamed about that.
That's the Strategic Defense Initiative, yes.
By the way, that SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, this is Star Wars. It was the laser missile defense, in case you're not familiar. This is also as loud as I can make the clip, in case that's an issue. It's as loud as it can go.
And not without reason, but they may exaggerate my influence somewhat on that, being Soviets. They consider me the most dangerous individual not in a government position in the world today from their standpoint.
You mentioned Robert Morse, who, with Arnaud de Bourgeois, wrote a famous book called The Spike. You are not sympathetic to Robert Morse, correct?
Neither one of them.
Or de Bourgeois.
I think de Bourgeois is easier. De Bourgeois is the fellow who's come under suspicion.
He's now the publisher of the Washington Times.
But he's the fellow that comes under suspicion of being your Soviet right-wing conservative Soviet agent because of what he did, or his whole life history is of that type. He actually has been, and Moss have been, agents of Soviet disinformation, even though they were the authors of the spike.
Let me ask you this, very, very brutally, very frontally. Were you ever a Marxist in your own opinion, ever?
I don't know.
Yes or no?
I don't know, because that the question does not lend
All right,
itself.
let me ask it this way. Are you today a Marxist?
I'm an expert on Marx, but I would not be considered a
You would
Marxist.
not. At what point did you change from the I don't know to no? And what changed you?
Oh, I would say in the 1950s.
In the 50s. This is nothing to do with the Vietnam War.
No,
this is the Eisenhower administration. It was what?
No. It was, I became involved with the Socialist Workers' Party, a Trotskyist organization.
Which is not right-wing, hardly.
But
very
largely because of my opposition to what we called McCarthyism in that period. Then in 1954, I had a chance to see the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party at somewhat close range, and saw something which I abhorred. And that was the end, essentially, as far as I was concerned.
So that's when you made that switch. Now you have said recently something.
And I never agreed with Marx as an economist.
Something.
All right, end of clip. So if this is your first exposure to LaRouche, I'm sorry, but this is basically, you know, where they're coming from. People talk about, I mean, if you look up, for example, just on his Wikipedia page, I mean, LaRouche was a well-connected figure. There's a lot written by him and his people. The Executive Intelligence Review is the name of the major publication that they would put out. There's the Schiller Institute. His wife is still active today, Helga Zepp LaRouche. Actually, let's put up the poster that we were talking about as far as connections to the PatSocs. Where is it? Defeat Green Fascism, number 3. They spelled it right on here. They spelled it fascism on the first one. But anyway, you can see right there. I'm sure Maupin would be here if he wasn't going through spank therapy or whatever he's doing. Samira Khan, Infracell, Jackson Hinkman, and then the sort of people that Daniel Burke with his arm around Hinckley, Diane Sayre. These are people, LaRouche politicians that they promote. Daniel Burke, of course, active online and has worked with Caleb Maupin in live streams and things like that. And then, of course, Helga Zepp LaRouche there on the right side of the poster. Excellent poster, by the way. A lot of fine use of color. Wink. Anyway. So this is where it's coming from. This is what's connected to this basic strategy of infiltrate the left to fight the left on its home turf, on its home territory. You just heard it from LaRouche himself. But like I was saying, there's a lot that they put out, whether it's the Schiller Institute or EIR or whatever it is, and there will be, you know, some grain of truth to some of the things that they say. They're also known for kind of insane sounding, really concocted conspiracy stuff. And, you know, some conspiracy, like running an empire, maintaining global capitalism, which is not in the interest of 99% of the planet. Yeah, that there's going to be some nefarious shit happening. So some of the things that are published in the world of like conspiracy research, yeah, that's some dark shit. There's also some pretty crazy like stuff that's concocted as well, that scapegoats random people and diverts attention away from some of the material causes behind things in history. So that's important to understand. But anyway, there's a lot of material out there. But even if you look at just something like the Wikipedia article, you can see what a crazy career LaRouche has had. Look particularly at the 1970s with Operation Mop-Up, where they were physically attacking people in CPUSA and other organizations. His, I think, bodyguard, Frank Hauser, who was former Grand Wizard, or whatever the fuck, like Grand Dragon of the KKK, and also an FBI informant, and like all this crazy shit. Later on in this clip, if you go to the S4A Twitter and look for it, one of the hosts of that interview asks LaRouche, so you have a pretty decent intelligence network around the world, and you publish all these reports. How does your thing work? He says, if I were hypothetically to come to your organization and like pay you money and say, give me intelligence on XYZ, is that something that your organization does? And LaRouche's ultimate answer is, no, we're basically in the publication business. If you've seen our reports, that's mainly what we do. But along the way, he adds that, well, no, we're not just private intelligence for hire, but we will sometimes work with governments on things that they're working on and things that they're looking into and things that we're looking into. And sometimes we take leaks from them and so there's two-way information sharing there, openly admitted in this television interview, as well as other stuff, excuse me, that you can find in various books written about, as well as even just starting off of the wiki article, which obviously Wikipedia is only as good as the sources that are put into it. So definitely check those. And there's a lot beyond that. But anyway, I was talking also about the sort of misogynistic element of this. Let's take a real quick look. We've never really discussed Samira Khan on here before. Absolute just, like rage farming content, posting really despicable stuff on a constant basis. If you search on, her posts about masculinity, I am pro-toxic masculinity, she says, and this is across years. There's no such thing. So there's no such thing as toxic masculinity, but if there is, she's for it. And recently I've been hearing a lot about toxic masculinity from liberals. Perhaps I'm lucky, but I haven't had much experience with this problem living in the United States. Haven't you? Are you very sheltered? Because look at the statistics on violence against women and so on. That's toxic masculinity. It's fairly prevalent, actually. Most men in this country suffer from an epidemic called toxic femininity. Now, some people use toxic femininity to just sort of like, well, women do it too. I don't know if she's doing it in that way. I don't know if she knows what she's doing, or if she's saying, like, actually, men are too feminine. Ha ha. You're all a bunch of cucks. Whatever. Negation of personality, as Hitler would put it. Anyway, what is toxic masculinity anyway? A World War II era Red Army soldier? No, it's the expectations that men will treat women in a way which is brutal and depersonalizing and sexist and harmful to women's self-esteem, physical well-being, etc., etc. There's nothing to do with... So she's sort of trying to make this false dichotomy of like, do you like the old history of communism? Then you're for toxic masculinity. No, this is actually totally absurd and just like a bad attempt. These people are not even good at what they do. And then she goes on later in another reply, well, no, replying to someone else, what you're describing is basically sexism and misogyny. The term toxic masculinity is stupid. Wait, aren't sexism and misogyny toxic? Yeah, I think they are. So anyway, but yeah, constant, she's on a crusade about defending toxic masculinity, and like I said, defending that Andrew Tate accused human trafficker guy. So that's what you're getting out of this movement. And again, stemming from LaRouche, so quality nowhere to be found. Anyway, the next thing up is finishing the RBN video, but you know what? Let's do that, and then we'll go to the chat. Because I think there's more continuity between that and what we've been doing versus the next thing. So we'll take a break after this. Let me just find now the video, and then this starts at 3:40. So,
but that's
all right. Let us skip ahead to 3:40. If my streaming program would like to tell me where 3:40 is, that would be great. Yeah, this is about where we left off before. Just make sure I can listen to it. And begin.
But other than that, we pretty much on the, like, I don't see large difference because I talked about before. I think people need to convert people in your community. Like,
Whoop. He's talking about MAGA, by the way. He's like, yeah, I don't see much difference between progressives and MAGA. Sure. You have Bernie Sanders, for example, like representative of U.S. progressivism, rallying people around universal health care and all kinds of other stuff. Then you have Trump. I love the clip from early in Trump's campaign. It was still the winter, where he's having security throw people out and instructs them to take their coats, to like throw them out into the cold without coats. So yeah, no, not a big difference really. What a fucking clown. Anyway, continuing.
Like me and CJ, I don't personally see a lot of these progressive MAGA people walking around, but I'm surrounded mostly by Black people, Latino, working class people. So those are the people I'm focused on bringing aboard.
That's a convenient way to be like, I mean, I've never seen one myself, but I assume they exist out there. No. And maybe you should listen to all the people telling you that this is like despicable clownery.
If you live in a rural red state, like you got to work within your own confines.
Yeah, it's also possible that you may just have to accept that for a lot of these people who are completely unwilling to understand anything that like God, Trump, and related media channels tell them, there's a lot of people, a core component of fascism, I would say, on the psychological level is willful ignorance. People who just will not get it, purposely will not get it. So this is a real thing you have to work with. There is an actual limit to like, you can't just like wave a wand and quote convert somebody. It doesn't work like that. You have to engage people in discussion, but if they're completely unwilling to engage, at some point you have to fight the right. This is not about left-right unity at the end of the day. It's about building the left so that we can win the struggle. But it is a struggle. In the end, there's a fight that has to take place. So we build the left to win the fight, not just to unite. This idea of just unity for its own sake is garbage. As even Nick says earlier, which we covered in the last stream, the earlier portion of this video, they have to renounce MAGA. Why do they have to renounce MAGA? Because it is completely diametrically opposed to most of the stuff that any socialist, communist, Marxist would stand for. And we'll see that when we read the YPO article after this. People involved in MAGA aren't doing anything like that.
That may be working with MAGA to bring them to the left with some issues, right? But
let me chime in here. Let me
chime in here because you're about to, like, now you're getting into total nonsense. So anyway, the other host saves him from, like, trying to go down that particular tortured path of logic.
Chime in here before we get back to Jackson. Let me chime in here from the perspective of the Marxist group, the Black Panthers. What did they do, Nick? Did they say, hey, what were they? White Patriots? Don't organize your community around our values.
Yeah, actually, the Black Panthers were pretty selective and careful about what they were doing. And it would have been suicide for them to organize with people who wanted them dead, for example, as MAGA people often shout about communists. So, which for MAGA, communists is everybody from, the quote, left-wing Republicans through the Democratic Party and onto us. They hate us with a burning passion. Like, have you been completely asleep since 2015 or since the Tea Party even, like 2009? Where have you been? But anyway, we are going to read an article about that, but we'll let him finish at 20 seconds.
And then we'll come together. Or did he say, you go organize your community, I'll organize our community, we'll come together to go fight these bastards. You get what I'm saying? So this could be what's happening. It's that any true coalition, working class.
All right, so that's the end of the clip. Let's get into this YPO article because I think that you'll find that the reality was not really the way that Jimmy Dore and RBN are describing it. Let's see here. YPO. So here's the article, and I don't have the link. Obviously, this is a stream and all, but you can find any of these articles. I always give the headline, and you can even just go into a search engine and put any particular sentence from this, into quotes, and you'll probably find it. So anyway, the Young Patriots Organization, Power to the People. This is actually from a website that is co-maintained by Hy Thurman, who is quoted here as a founding member of the Young Patriots. So this is an inside view. The Young Patriots organization, the original Rainbow Coalition. Does MAGA strike you as a movement that's particularly interested in a Rainbow Coalition? Yeah, probably not. So the quote there, racism was a demon that had to be driven out and slain if we were going to have unity with other groups and to believe that all people have a right to self-determination and freedom. We had to change to make life tolerable and for life to have some sort of meaning. Quoting Hy Thurman, a founding member of the Young Patriots. So yeah, you can work with ex-MAGA people if they're actually ex-MAGA people. If you can find MAGA people who are willing to say that racism is a demon that has to be driven out and slain, great. Then those people aren't MAGA anymore. All right. Defying the stereotypes that they were ignorant hillbillies and hopeless racists, uptown Chicago's Southern migrants and their allies organized the Young Patriots Organization, YPO, in 1968. Again, this was the time of the New Left civil rights movement. Uptown had some of the worst poverty in the city, and living conditions were grim, with hunger and poor health for many. So, let's just start with that first sentence, defying the stereotypes that they were ignorant hillbillies and hopeless racists. I think MAGA plays into that, to be honest. This is the whole deplorables thing, where they're like, I'm a proud deplorable. Well, that's not overcoming that image. That's leaning into it, actually. The Young Patriots grew out of the work of the Uptown Join organization, Join being an acronym, a unique collaboration between Southern migrants and young radicals from the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS. This was a major New Left organization. So right off the bat, MAGA grew out of the campaign slogan for a Republican billionaire slumlord candidate who ran his campaign on racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, using campaign strategists like Steve Bannon and what's that other guy? The guy with the Nixon tattoo, Stone, Roger Stone, who's also an admirer of Lyndon LaRouche. There's another connection there. You can find clips of him talking about Lyndon LaRouche. Anyway, that's where MAGA comes from. It's the campaign slogan for one of the scummiest Republican Party candidates ever to exist. Then the YPO, which came out of a coalition between Southern migrants who were coming from the South, moving up to Chicago, and the SDS. That's different origins, man. That's completely different. Like, it's not even close. First organized in 1964, Join organized community meetings, marches, rent strikes, pickets, and civil disobedience to protest the poverty-producing policies of the Mayor Richard J. Daley Democratic machine and its corporate sponsors. Does MAGA do anything like that? Of course not. In 1966, a group of uptown men left Join to form the Goodfellows. They felt that Join was too dominated by the mostly middle-class students, even with their good intentions. So this is a common story in the U.S. left. A lot of times left things will be started by more middle-class, like college students that have more education because, why? How do you connect with the history of the left in this country, the history of which is brutally suppressed? I mean, you're not going to get it in your K through 12 education necessarily. And unless you have parents that are already connected with it, it can be hard to even know that it exists. So that's, this is an example of the very sort of, learned communists who study history and theory helping to get the masses organized in a way where they can go on and do this thing. So, that's typical. So they did split off after that initial coalition. So, hoping to unite the local youth gangs into a progressive political force, the Goodfellows initially targeted the rampant police brutality that plagued the uptown community. Tell me, what's the overlap between MAGA and Blue Lives Matter? I'll wait. The Goodfellows organized a march to the Summerdale police station, showing uptown that a new day was dawning. Retaliation by the Chicago police came swiftly. The cops raided the Join office, planted drugs, and arrested a number of key organizers. The raid showed that the Daley machine viewed the growing rebellion in Uptown as a threat to its power. Picture there. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King proposed a Poor People's Campaign, which would set up a multiracial 1968 encampment in Washington, D.C. Participants would use civil disobedience to pressure Congress for social programs to end poverty and stop the unpopular war in Vietnam. Dr. King's assassination and the subsequent urban rebellions did not deter the Poor People's Campaign from coming to Washington in 1968. It also did not deter Uptown activists from joining the campaign in D.C. Members of the Goodfellows like Junebug Boykin, Bobby McGinnis, and Hy Thurman began discussing the possibilities of a multiracial working-class alliance in Chicago. They studied the Illinois Black Panther Party and the Young Lords Organization, who were combining political militancy with community organizing and direct service programs. So again, find me an example of MAGA doing anything remotely like this, coming from a left background, and, anyway, anything like this. The Young Patriots eventually allied with the Illinois Black Panther, Black Panther Party, African Americans based on the South and West Side, and the Young Lords Organization, Latinos based in Lincoln Park. The Panthers and the Young Lords were battling poverty and racism in their communities. MAGA fucking is like a white nationalist movement fundamentally. Anyway. The three groups formed the original Rainbow Coalition, which became an influential revolutionary working class movement for liberation. The idea was to build a movement of the oppressed which crossed the traditional racial lines that divide working people. With help of Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, the Young Patriots Free Health Clinic opened in September of 1969. Again, Republican maggots, famous for their support of community health care, etc. Like, what? This was only one example of how the Patriots, Young Lords, and Panthers collaborated in mutual aid. The clinic attracted doctors and nurses from local medical schools and hospitals to serve a population largely excluded from the mainstream health industry. Responding to the dire needs of an abused and impoverished community, the Young Patriots also organized breakfast for children programs, food pantries, and legal services in Uptown. Their service programs were not welcomed by the Daily Machine, who used the police and various city departments to harass them. The Patriots fought back with demonstrations and sit-ins. They demanded that the local Chicago Board of Health clinic expand its hours, and with their allies, the Young Patriots led an occupation of the clinic, with patients accompanied by 4 doctors, 3 nurses, and 3 social workers. They followed that up with a rally the next day, forcing the city clinic to expand its hours and hire more staff. That's fucking awesome. But, again, wake me up when, MAGA does this. The YPO also had a vision for Uptown that clashed with the Daily Machine's plans to evict Uptown residents and build a community college. The YPO joined with Voice of the People, led by Chuck Geary, later renamed the Uptown Area People's Planning Coalition, UAAP. The UAAP brought in architects to design and plan a Hank Williams Village, named for the famous country music singer. Hank Williams Village was based on the layout of a southern town with single-family homes as well as affordable condos. Medical facilities would be available along with green space with parks and playgrounds. The plan included a food co-op, a public laundry, pharmacy, and a new hotel for new arrivals who needed inexpensive shelter until they found jobs. It sounds like immigrants, I don't know. I mean, of course, this is across state lines, not country lines, but anyway, taking our jobs. Despite widespread support for the plan, it was ultimately blocked by powerful financial interests. The land was cleared for the college, and many residents were evicted. This was a major blow to the Young Patriots because their members and supporters were among those forced to leave their homes, which may have also, conveniently also served the Daily administration. During the entire time of its existence, the Rainbow Coalition had come under intense police pressure, including assassinations, arrests, and constant harassment. John Howard and Raymond Tackett of the Young Patriots were both murdered under murky circumstances. Black Panthers Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were assassinated. The mass eviction of Uptown residents combined with the police repression took their toll, and the YPO was forced to disband as an organization in 1972. The Rainbow Coalition, as a formal organization, came to an end in the early 1970s. The infamous COINTELPRO program, counterintelligence program, targeted the Rainbow Coalition on orders from the highest levels of the U.S. government. A radical movement of working-class people united across racial lines was viewed by U.S. ruling circles as a threat to capitalism itself, which it was. Past efforts to, and consciously was so. Past efforts to build multiracial radical movements in the USA had also come under severe repression. Reconstruction, the populist movement, the radical unionism of the industrial workers of the world, the Southern tenant farmer revolt during the Great Depression, CIO's industrial union organizing, and the civil rights movement itself. The Rainbow Coalition proved to be no exception. There's one more screen. I just want to comment on the populist movement. There's a difference between the populism of the 1880s and 90s. This was before a lot of the U.S. was proletarianized, and it was still much more agrarian, versus populism in the 1930s and beyond, when the population was more proletarianized. And, well, just from a proletarian perspective, the appropriate class interest or class ideology would be socialism, Marxism. Before the proletariat existed in large numbers, the populist movement was a progressive force among the more agrarian economy of the time. Yet the idea lived on, both in segregated Chicago and in the USA as a whole. Sorry, one more note on populism. Not only was it more appropriate for a proletarianized population to adopt Marxism, but the lingering remnants of populism that persisted into the 20th century and are being revived in the neo-populist stuff today were more explicitly anti-Marxist and anti-proletarian. I just wanted to make that point. Anyway, yet the idea lived on, both in segregated Chicago and in the USA as a whole. A number of Rainbow Coalition veterans were instrumental in the campaigns of Harold Washington, the reformist African-American mayor of Chicago from 1983 to 1987. Jesse Jackson borrowed the name Rainbow Coalition for his progressive presidential bids in 1984 and 1988. Today, Chicagoans can experience the rainbow of racial unity in the Fight for 15, the education justice movement, the housing rights movement, as well as in present-day uptown community organizations. Note that MAGA is not mentioned. Or the Republican Party. Why would you? It's fucking absurd. The Republican Party is like the absolute worst, most hostile, like, parts of, like, country club society in the United States. Note down at the bottom, admin by Hy Thurman and Jeb Middlebrook. So that was the guy who was quoted at the beginning. So just trying to set the record straight here for all those who are willing to listen. Remember, willful ignorance, key component of fascist efforts. For all those willing to listen, this article will, again, compare to MAGA. Compare to even what potential do you think MAGA has? They would have to completely, turn everything they're doing upside down. All right. Let's take a minute before we go to the chat to thank the patrons whose names are on the screen, patreon.com/socialismforall. This content, if you're enjoying it, I would be making content regardless if anybody paid me. I wouldn't be able to spend as much time on it, though, if people weren't kicking in on the Patreon. It's super helpful. It's also super encouraging. Names in green have been contributing for 2 years straight. Names in yellow for over a year. That's awesome. And really appreciate everybody's engagement and support on this. All the people who send articles in the YouTube comments, in Twitter, on Reddit, through the Patreon, in the chats here on Twitch. All the people trying to make contributions, and it's really much appreciated. You are making this channel what it is. Otherwise, it would just be me talking into a void. I'm glad that it's landing with people. I'm glad that it's helpful for people. I wanted to do more reading to contribute to the rebirth of a communist movement and, know more about what I'm talking about doing the reading. And I'm glad that so many other thousands of people are joining in with that as well. Engagement also counts, so like, share, subscribe. That helps YouTube to recommend this to more people. All right, let's put the standard screen up for a minute and go check in with the chat. You see how much more we're getting done today? When we say get organized, this is why. Just the sheer, making a list, it's helped tremendously. So, all right. What else do we have going? Oh, we got a troll already. It was a troll right after I stopped paying attention to the chat. Fuck socialism. Do you think it's cool? Welcome to Russia. So, for the record, Russia has formally and openly not been socialist for over 30 years. Thank you for joining the 21st century. Even before that, they were revisionist, which was part of what led up to the dissolution of the USSR against the vast majority of people's wishes. But yeah, Russia has not been socialist for at least 30 years. Wasn't there a strike that was postponed out of respect for the Queen of England's death? I heard that. So they're saying looks like the strike is on for October 8th. That's just fucking absurd. When like organized labor pauses like whatever reformist strike they're doing in the first place for a monarch, do you have any self-respect at all? There's a video about I escaped a cult, in quotes, and this woman talks about being in LaRouche's groups. I saw this even before I knew about the Maupin and PatSocs Nazi connection. Yeah, so LaRouche, they would use a technique, or they're accused of using a technique called ego stripping. And they would, I guess, get people in these sessions to just like break down and like accept LaRouche programming. Why do all social chauvinists start out as Trotskyites? Opportunism. Who knows? But yeah, it's a consistent trend. I think also, what's his name? Bill Kristol, famous neocon, Iraq War, George W. Bush and Cheney pusher. Oh, the Schiller Institute, LaRouche think tank, was responsible for pushing New Age bullshit a couple of years ago. See Adam Neely's A equals 432. Yeah, so LaRouche had this really big thing about classical music and like wanted to outlaw like other types of music, and also was like lobbying fiercely to like standard concert tuning. It's changed over the years. Actually, if you study concert tuning, it and this goes back to like the 1800s and the day, maybe even before, when obviously live music was the only thing that there was, and also classical music was like, that was most of the performances that were put on. So concert tuning today is mostly recognized as 440 hertz for middle A, but it used to be lower. But if you look, different orchestras would tune to like slightly higher pitches, and it seems like this may have been in part to like compete, to be like slightly higher in pitch, to be like more to have their stuff stand out more. But anyway, I was reading an article about that a while ago. Yeah, anyway, they have this whole kind of thing about the evil vibrations of 440 and all this stuff. LaRouche, there's some wacky shit in there. I mean, but and harmful. On the Trotskyist thing, Simon says, and that's a commoner named Simon, that's not some weird new thing I'm doing. All distorters of Marxism start out with fundamental mistakes in their understandings of this ideology. And yeah, Trotskyism would be one of those. By the way, I hate referring to Marxism as an ideology because it makes it seem like just another idea that popped out of someone's head. I hear you as far as the connotations of ideology. We mean ideology just as far as a system of thinking for a particular class. But I mean, I hear what you're saying about the connotations. But yes, properly understood, Marxism is a reflection of emerging proletarian self-understanding. It's proletarian ideology. What Marx and Engels, of course, did in the early days, in the 1840s, 1850s, they did a lot of criticism of the earlier socialists. Marx and Engels were not the first socialists. So they would look back at the 1820s and 30s and their contemporaries, and they would criticize and satirize and sometimes just mock some of the, what they called utopian socialists, who were socialists. They were anti-capitalist. They would criticize capitalism, but they weren't doing so in what they considered a scientific way, using material analysis as the basis. So anyway, all of this was proletarian ideology. Why was it arising then? Well, proletarians have always existed to some extent, but it's really in capitalism that the proletariat becomes a huge force and the revolutionary force that will be behind the next major revolution. The revolution of socialism against capitalism. The proletariat is the basis for that, and the proletariat only grows to sufficient numbers to do that, even though they've existed in previous stages of class society under capitalism. So anyway, socialism is proletarian ideology. It's what is in the proletarian's interest, in other words. So it's ideology in the sense of, self-analysis, self-understanding of the material conditions and class position of a working person that doesn't own capital, and what's in the proletariat's interests. So Marx and Engels really just refined and improved that dramatically, and took it, like light years further. But anyway, yes, I understand. It's like propaganda. There is propaganda comes from the word to propagate, propaganda really is just materials in service of propagating an idea or whatever, information. But because so much propaganda, so much of it tends to be one-sided, heavily biased, like, misleading even. It's the word itself, propaganda, has taken on that connotation as well. Originally, it was a more neutral thing. Is that CIA podcast attempting to appeal to more woke or left-leaning sentiment, or is it more after, say, the Joe Rogan audience? Honestly, the decision to step out of the shadows, which is like what they make a reference to in their title, I don't know who it's going to appeal to. I mean, ex-military people, I really don't know. Haven't listened to it yet. Will be listening to it for the sake of like keeping tabs, but I can't see that really working too well for them. But then again, I mean, you turn on any kind of like corporate media, it's reflecting CIA talking points of one kind or another. Not uniformly and exclusively, but in the end, that's a lot of the analysis that they sort of finish on and really try to pass on to the audience as far as the conclusions. They're obviously they don't want the audience to draw more radical conclusions involving deep social change, abolition of capitalism, etc. Let's see. Yeah, so there's a distinction here between Marxism as a set of like social analysis. It is a method, it's scientific thinking. At the same time, the ideology which it generates is also called Marxism. So, yeah, but fair. It's a doctrine of proletarian liberation. But yeah, doctrine. Well, then you're, quote, doctrinaire, and that has connotations too. So, these are just, you have to work within the limitations of language. I do like, I'm for reclaiming ideology. That's what I would say. But yeah, it's basically self-understanding. People are giving shout-outs to Blowback, a good podcast about the CIA podcast and the U.S. Empire. Yeah. I am not familiar with that one, but mental note. I'm sure it's to humanize the CIA. Why else would they do it? Definitely. Whoa, here's an odd troll. Wow, the all caps really sell it. Your Nazi friends in Ukraine, are getting obliterated and retreating. You Nazi scum, and then a bunch of slurs. It helps, yeah, when you string together 6 slurs in a row. Nice, libtard parasite scum. Well, nice knowing you. But we don't support the Ukrainian bourgeoisie either. But Russia had no right to do what it did. I had somebody saying, well, was Russia just supposed to watch build up on their border? I mean, they could do things about it within their own country, but unfortunately the answer is they did not have a right to invade. Under any even bourgeois legal standards, any social, they are a capitalist country invading another capitalist country and blowing up schools and apartment buildings, among other things. They have no right to do that by any standard. It's that simple. Somebody's asking me for me to respond to something. I'm not really sure what exactly it was, though. Oh, you were talking about the troll. Yeah. Don't feed the trolls. Seriously, just let them do their thing, and I will come along and remove them. It's much easier. Otherwise, it clogs up the chat. The LaRouche's tradition of dodging questions. Yeah, one of the hosts says that. He says it's like If you ever have a mercury thermometer where the mercury breaks and then you try to scoop it up, that was a bit like, trying to get LaRouche to answer the questions. Am I the only one who gets the vibes that LaRouche looks like an uncle that failed at managing his enterprise and got kicked out of the CEO position? He's definitely got like the evil genius vibe. Again, watch the Al Franken spoof, because while the substance isn't there, he got the delivery like pretty much spot on. Yeah, creepy stuff. Actually, so I was, as you know, back in the 2000s, like doing anti-war stuff. That was how I got involved with the left. There was overlap with conspiracy things. We were talking about like libertarians and things like that. I do think that 9/11 Truth was right on the facts, although that got completely swarmed by libertarians, because I think, although it was correct, and if the fundamental premise of 9/11 Truth was correct, not only was the invasion of Afghanistan disproportionate, which I think most people could agree, even if 9/11 happened the way the U.S. government said, the U.S. response was wrong and disproportionate. There never should have been an invasion. But if the thing of 9/11 Truth was correct, there was no basis for the invasion whatsoever, disproportionate or otherwise. There was no basis for any action, because Afghanistan had nothing to do with it in any capacity in any way. But anyway, along the way, one of the prominent voices in that is a person named Webster Tarpley, and he was LaRouche's brain for quite a while. Egghead extraordinaire, Webster Tarpley, and so that is probably the most LaRouche that I'm familiar with, is that kind of thing. He split off, from what I was reading, from that. Some say he didn't split off enough. But, yeah, LaRouche people, like I said, it's like the guy had a vast intelligence network, and definitely that just weird stuff going on there. And it comes across when you hear the guy talking. All right. To imagine looking into an incel weirdo named Infracel would end up as a rabbit hole investigation to a cult leader from the 70s. Yeah. Why am I watching a 40-year-old video? Well, maybe you came in late, but I think that was pretty well explained. Getting aggressive there. LaRouche sliding in to stop bell bottoms in rock music. Somebody knows what LaRouche is about. This is literally where the PatSocs came from. Yes, you're absolutely right. All right, so our chat's been running closer to like 30 people. We've got about 60 in, and there's too many trolls. So I did have somebody volunteer to time people out, but we may need to do that more. You take one look at that LaRouche poster, and you can just tell the people who made it are insane. Yeah. All right, we're going to have to get back to the articles in a minute. I am just catching up with any more comments here. Again, try to be sparing with your comments, because the longer it takes me to scroll through these, just, even well-meaning comments, it just clogs it up. Who is Schiller? I'm going to make a note of that. Like, why do they call it the Schiller Institute? We'll get into that at a later time. I'll present some information on that. Somebody says, regarding 9/11 Truth, how true is the idea that the Saudi government was involved? I hate that government, but why would a U.S. puppet do that, if not at the command of the U.S.? The Saudi thing, this was like something that Michael Moore was pushing a lot while directly ignoring a lot of other stuff. I think it's largely something to explain things without looking at evidence that directly undermines like core tenets of the official story like what hit the Pentagon, for example, things like that. So to me, it seems like the Saudi angle, there may have been some joint intelligence. It's been a long time since I'm not fresh on that at all. But I know that there were 9/11 victim families that were trying to sue the Saudi government. This struck me as like a misdirection. But a lot of that stuff came after I kind of stopped paying attention to what was going on. This the 9/11 truth stuff, it kind of hit its peak in like 2006, 2007. Even by 2008, because of the economic crash and because of the McCain-Obama election, like people were already not talking about the war and not talking about terrorism so much. I think a lot of that stuff came up after. I know there were some like, yeah. So anyway, pass, I guess is the short answer. It's a decent question. To me, it seemed like when people started talking about that more, the Saudi government, it seemed to be like the people talking about the most also were not talking about the U.S. government at all. So it seemed to be kind of a substitute, limited hangout for that. But yeah, it's been a super long time, like 15 years, since that stuff was really going. All right. Anyway, we're caught up with the chat, so let us get back into the content for today. So actually, we were just talking about the war. Let's read the KKE statement on the Ukraine war. So this is from today, actually, regarding Putin's address. So Putin is, we mentioned yesterday, calling up many thousands of reservists to go fight in Ukraine. This seems somewhat futile, but I mean, if the fact that he's having to break out all these reserves 7 months into this thing, the word that was used to describe Iraq was quagmire, and I'm definitely getting similar vibes off of this. But let's see what the KKE says. Statement of the KKE on Putin's address. Following the public address of the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, on Wednesday, 21st of September, the press office of the CC of the Communist Party of Greece, KKE, issued a statement underlining the escalation of the imperialist conflict and demanding Greece's immediate disengagement from the dangerous plans of the EU and NATO. The statement reads, "The imperialist war being waged in Ukraine between the Euro-Atlantic forces and capitalist Russia is headed for a new devastating escalation. It is confirmed that the buildup of military forces and materiel on both sides does not lead to the end of the war, but instead feeds the vicious circle of the continuation and intensification of the conflict." I would agree. In recent months, the USA, NATO, and the EU have embarked on an unprecedented political, military, and financial support of the reactionary Zelensky government with the aim of reversing the balance of power on the battlefields, which now extend over 1,300 kilometers. Modern warfare systems, military advisors, mercenaries, and the stocks of NATO countries' military depots have been generously provided for the continuation and escalation of the war, which is being waged not for freedom and the right of the Ukrainian people to self-determination in choosing allies as they claim, but for the interests of the Western monopolies. On the other hand, the Russian leadership, which proceeded with the unacceptable and reprehensible military invasion of Ukraine, is taking additional measures, considering that it is drifting away from its objectives. Putin's address on yesterday, the 21st of September, provides for the beginning of the annexation process of 20% of Ukraine's territory to Russia, which will be carried out both by political means, such as referendums set up in those regions, and by military means, such as the legalization of paramilitary volunteer groups, the partial mobilization of 300,000 reservists, and the threat of the use of nuclear weapons. The Russian leadership, seeking to conceal the aims of its own monopolies, once again invokes the so-called denazification of Ukraine and the self-determination of the Russian-speaking populations, adding the risk of the disintegration of Russia in the event of a military defeat. So yeah, people are talking about this from the socialist perspective. What you want is the defeat of one's own country in the imperialist war. So every country that gets involved in this war, what we as socialists want is for capitalism to crumble, capitalism to be discredited, capitalism to become unpopular, which of course we help through our agitation about the capitalism being the cause of why your apartment building got flattened, why you lost all your belongings, why you had to move like to another country because you got displaced, etc. Capitalism is the reason, and if that is pointed out by adequate socialist agitation, education, and organization, then you have the possibility of a communist takeover of a capitalist country. Lenin wrote about this in The Defeat of One's Own Government in the Imperialist War, and that is the Marxist-Leninist position here. We don't support bourgeois governments or their bullshit claims of, quote, denazification. We are looking to see capitalism abolished. And when a capitalist country loses a war, that's a real moment of weakness. So that's the idea. Continuing. The Greek people as well. Now, let me just add, the tricky thing is that both Russia and Ukraine were previously socialist. And they've been subjected to 30 years of anti-communist propaganda, all the younger people. And then, of course, they're, even the last few years of like the breakup of the USSR prior to 1991 weren't necessarily the best either. So you have that to contend with. But as socialists, that's the only real way forward that we see. That's not to say it's not complicated. Anyway, the Greek people, as well as all peoples, must reject the false pretexts used by both sides and target the real causes of the imperialist war, which concern the division of mineral wealth, energy, territories, and labor force, pipelines and commodity transport networks, geopolitical supports, and market shares. That is what the bourgeois classes and their imperialist alliances are clashing over. Need some water. The New Democracy government and the other Euro-Atlantic parties in our country, such as Syriza and PASOK, bear heavy responsibilities for Greece's involvement in the war, for the use of the country's military bases and infrastructure for the needs of the imperialist war and other NATO and U.S. plans, for the enlargement of the NATO alliance with new countries, which they jointly voted for last week, for the shipment of weapon systems, ammunition, etc. This involvement casts a dark shadow over the future of our people, who are becoming the target of Russian retaliation, thus becoming entangled in the meat grinder of an unjust war that is waged for foreign interests. We demand that 1. Greece's participation and involvement in the imperialist war in Ukraine be stopped immediately. 2. All NATO and U.S. military bases in our country that are being used as bases of war be immediately closed down. Greek territories, infrastructure, and resources stop being military strongholds. 3, I can count. No Greek military corps be sent to Ukraine, to countries bordering it, or to other imperialist missions. No conscript, officer, or non-commissioned officer outside the borders. That the shipment of war supplies and means of warfare from Greece be stopped. Greece's sanctions against Russia, which follow EU guidelines, this is another point, which follow EU guidelines and have major economic consequences for the Greek people, be lifted. And finally, we strengthen the struggle for the disengagement of our country from the imperialist unions of NATO and the EU, with the people being masters in our land. That's the end of the KKE statement. So I just want to say full support to that. I'm in the U.S., and this is a podcast. We're involved in media efforts to raise interest and knowledge of socialism in the United States and anybody else who cares to listen to these audiobooks and commentary. This is not a party. So what would we like to see from the U.S.? It's a bit strange, I think, to demand that the U.S. get out of NATO. Obviously, this is a fine thing. NATO needs to be dismantled. The problem with making a demand like that in the case of the U.S., and it's not really a problem per se, like there's nothing wrong with the idea of disbanding NATO. The problem is Greece making that demand. That's something that probably realistically can be done while leaving NATO intact. The U.S., quote, withdrawing from NATO probably would be close to the unraveling of NATO, which of course means that we should support that. On the other hand, why I say that this is like a strange demand that just to make a loan, you need a much more comprehensive program as well to make that. Greece probably could declare like Greece out of NATO and have a basis for doing that. The U.S., if the U.S. got out of NATO, again, the U.S. is playing the role currently of the military support for global imperialism generally. Like all the client states that depend on imperialism that are in the U.S.'s alignment. You're calling for the U.S. to be something fundamentally different than it is. So therefore, the point is, the demand from the U.S. is not so simple. You need something bordering on more like the virtual dismantling of the U.S. as we know it. This is probably going to be one of the last steps. It's not to say we shouldn't work towards it. It's not to say we shouldn't keep it as a goal. But I think realistically it should be understood that there's probably, you could probably get NATO to collapse first by other countries withdrawing before you could ever get the U.S. out. Obviously, we can try to get the U.S. out, but again, what would NATO be without the U.S. and what would imperialism be without the U.S. period? So they need the U.S. or something like it to be what it is, because imperialism doesn't work without the kind of military violence that the U.S. is running. So, this is like the sort of the PatSocs thing of like, well, we want a U.S. that's free of imperialism. Well, but that's been its entire purpose from like day one. So you would need something much closer to like a dismantling of the entire system. It's in other words, it's the heart of this whole system. I think it'd probably be a lot easier to chop off the arms and legs. The heart's going to be probably the last thing standing. So it's just difficult. And for those of us in the U.S., obviously make these demands with the parties, but I think it needs to be followed up with a lot more education. Otherwise, you get a lot of cart being put before the horse in terms of non-socialist, quote, anti-imperialists who, rightly identify the U.S. as the source of a lot of military violence, but don't really understand it's going to take a socialist transformation of the global economy, like a complete cooperative, peaceful, planned dismantling of this heart of the empire. And I think what we'll probably realistically see, and full support to agitation towards it, is more peripheral countries like Greece pulling out of NATO. And then if you can get even some of the bigger players, France, etc., out of it, those would be huge wins. In other words, back in the 2003, the Iraq War, there was a lot of talk of the U.S. going it alone with like invading Iraq, which of course led to the wonderful soundbite of George Bush. And don't forget Poland. Or no, you forgot Poland. That was in the debate with John Kerry. Well, you forgot Poland. And there's other countries joining too. God, he's such a fucking idiot. Anyway, if you pull all of these sort of allies of imperialism out one by one, I think that's probably the most likely thing. The U.S. is the most out of control, most violent imperialist power. I think just realistically, it's going to be the last to go. Something could happen. History's full of surprises. But, I think we would probably see Greece getting out of NATO before we see the U.S. getting out. Because, again, the U.S. has been entrusted with, it's the U.S.'s job to keep this entire thing going in a way that it is not Greece's job to keep that entire thing going. Hopefully that's clear. I'm sure many people will deliberately misinterpret that. Anyway, speaking of the U.S., let us move on to the next topic, which is CPUSA. Fucking A. Where did this go? Vote against fascism. Oh, no, this was the old one. I did a video on this one. Vote against fascism. This is from back in June. Did a whole video about that at the time. Please stop tailing the fucking Dems. Anyway, they're doing it again. So this is if you put in a search for CPUSA just into YouTube. This is exactly what you're likely to see. Communist Party USA. Incidentally, S4A is now leading CPUSA by over 1,600 subscribers on YouTube. And CPUSA's account is 6 years older than S4A's. When a lone rando doing basic educational work and commentary is eclipsing, quote, the Communist Party of the United States, you're fucking up. You're fucking up. I know that a lot of U.S. communists are creatively inclined. Does the party not let you do media work? Why is this not more vibrant? Why is it being, overtaken by, literally a lone rando who started doing this 2.5 years ago? Shouldn't be the case. I mean, we're happy to do it here. and be involved in the movement would be doing it even if the CPUSA thing was bigger. But to me, this is a sign of a problem. And that's it's in the spirit of constructive criticism that I mentioned that. I know many CPUSA members, rank and file. See, this is kind of the thing with CPUSA. The rank and file is actual MLs, actual radical communists. And the leadership just absolutely just sits on it in very predictable ways that are very consistent from one decade to the next. Obviously, it's the United States, it's a police state, there's going to be intelligence infiltration and whatnot, but like, it's just the struggle in the CPUSA at the higher levels seems stagnant. So anyway, you got Joe Sims there, that's the guy in the first video in front of the couch. Vote against fascism, this is from 4 days ago, midterms coming up, and then below it, Good Morning Revolution, Fascism Revisited Edition. And then there's this screenshot there with the thumbnail. Do we need a new definition of fascism? What I said about this is, if you're trying to make fascism into something that can be stopped by voting for the Democratic Party, then yeah, you would need a new definition of fascism. Unfortunately, that definition would not actually serve to do anything useful for the U.S. or global working class. Stop tailing the fascist collaborating Democratic Party. Things still get worse when the Democratic Party is in power. They are not allies. They are not anti-fascist. They are fascist collaborators. So, again, this insane idiocy needs to stop. It's opportunism of like just an extreme level. And they've been called out on it so many times. So like I was saying, I know a lot of CPUSA members are great people. They're in the comments. I chat with them often. I DM with them. And they're like, I don't know why my party is doing this. Well, can somebody figure this out? Because we need progress here. It's either got to be CPUSA gets left behind, and you can understand then the effort of like a PCUSA back a number of years ago. It was like 2014 or 2016 when they broke away from CPUSA and they were trying to do a non-revisionist, non-opportunist thing. I think maybe it was too soon. The movement as a whole, probably not healthy enough, kind of went PatSoc and shitty, and I have not been real impressed with PCUSA, to say the least. And now they're kind of splitting again. They've had a couple of splits even in the few years that they've existed. I'm hoping by the end of this decade that we're going to have a good party, maybe in even 4 or 5 years. I think that the movement is getting more knowledgeable. The movement is getting our political immune system sharpened, and I think that all of that is showing progress. But something decisive needs to happen with CPUSA here because it's fucking embarrassing at this point. And I know it's not you and the rank and file doing it, but like, who controls this party? It doesn't seem very democratic if no one in the organization agrees with what the leadership is doing, like, ever. Obviously. So, where are we going with this? Yes. So this is from René Georges' blog. There's an article, Joe Sims turns Lenin into a liberal, CPUSA wallows. This is from about 2 years ago, in the lead up to the presidential election, when they were putting all kinds of vote against fascism, vote for Biden stuff. So anyway, let's read some of this article. Again, this is the same author we were reading from about Paul Cockshot's anti-LGBTQ bigotry videos that he was putting out. Did an excellent, lengthy takedown of Cockshot that we could only read a quarter of within time limits. Same thing here. We're not going to, I think, be able to read the whole thing, but let's get into some of this, and I will post a link to this in the video description. So it starts with a quote from Harrison George, writing in The Crisis in the CPUSA. But as to leadership to apply party program, it is evident that as a rule, the present leadership cannot be trusted to carry out a revolutionary line, no matter how carefully our National Convention may write one into its resolutions. From top to bottom, this corrupt and incorrigibly opportunist leadership must be swept away and replaced by fresh and proletarian leadership from the depths of the party. I mean, this was written a while ago. I would say that every word still applies. It is said, and not without some grain of truth, that even the party ranks, especially those who came to the party in the years of reformist domination, coming in all too often on the basis of an acceptance of reformist outlook as final and sufficient to meet their approval, have had their ideological development frozen at that level and are incapable of generating a new and revolutionary leadership. Well, just to speak to that for a second, that's part of what we're trying to do here at S4A, and I think other channels are trying to do as well, is to unfreeze and unstick that, to put out non-reformist, non-revisionist material that is going to help to generate that new and revolutionary leadership, whether it goes into CPUSA, whether it forms some other group, whatever form it manifests as, whatever form the people involved decide to, create with it. This is what we're trying to do, trying to get back to what was Marxism-Leninism all about, what have the various conversations that have developed in the ensuing years been about, what have been the problems of the movement, trying to get the average interested communist more familiar with the stuff so that when you do go into party work, it's actually effective and it doesn't, recreate all these mistakes and it doesn't fall for the errors and it doesn't feed into them. So anyway, getting on to René Georges' writing now. I've already written about the CPUSA in 2 articles, a criticism of their pacifism and a criticism of the broader trend of left unity. However, I myself have not been a member of a communist party. I was first a member of the IWW in addition to my workplace's union. Then I quit that and was unaffiliated for a long time, during which I was very much still active. After not receiving responses from the other communist parties in my area, I applied to CPUSA with the hope of meeting other committed Marxist-Leninists and anti-fascists, and perhaps making ideological contributions to the party with my comradely criticisms. Let's just add there, key phrase there, after not receiving responses from the other communist parties in my area. I think PSL, from what I've heard, is awful at this. And if you want more people to join your party, you absolutely have to get better. It's literally your own fault for just not replying to new member inquiries. It's one of the most basic things that you have to do. And, unless you want people going to the other organizations, basic party work. So anyway, continuing. I linked my blog on my party application, was accepted to the party. I sent my criticisms to the co-chair, Joe Sims, who did not read them, which he admitted himself in our private conversation, and immediately accused me of slander. I have seen him and the party in general try to cloak their reformism and liberalism in Marxist-Leninist terminology and references, which I hope to expose here. Part 1, Joe Sims' Outlook. Joe Sims described the following quote from me as, quote, slander. Why should anyone believe that CPUSA is even committed to overcoming capitalism? The chair, Joe Sims, has denounced class struggle, the dictatorship of the proletariat, democratic centralism, and even the names Marxism and Leninism as the, quote, worst aspects of Marxism. It should be noted that Sims at first ignored me altogether. Then when I told him that I was a party member, he demanded my name and location, looked me up in the party database, since he brought up the fact that I was not a member for very long. Quite telling that Sims is happy to ignore principled criticism from a worker, but feels it necessary to attack it when it comes from inside the party. He told me that I was, quote, in the wrong place in the CPUSA. Indeed, the above would be slander if it were incorrect. If it were correct, however, it can only be, quote, slander in the sense that it would tarnish his reputation, a tacit admission that holding those lines is incorrect. Sims claimed, quote, it's a goddamn lie that I don't uphold Marxism-Leninism and I don't recognize the class struggle. A complete, unadulterated lie. Unfortunately for Sims' reputation, I was in fact merely quoting his own words. I said he denounced class struggle, the dictatorship of the proletariat, democratic centralism, and the terms Marxism-Leninism as the worst aspects of Marxism, beliefs he clearly outlines in his 3-part series, 10 Worst and Best Ideas of Marxism. Now, I'll add here, somebody's mentioning they've heard Sims call that a joke. I've never seen that. They hadn't seen him call it that either, but that's apparently one of the defenses, whether it is based in reality or not. For it is, he was just kidding. So we'll see. I'm sure somebody will come up with some information on that. Listen to this. The very first one that he lists is the dictatorship of the proletariat, where he says, quote, even if I agreed with it conceptually, I don't. Number 7 is Marxism-Leninism. And in the second part, he decries the slogan, the class struggle intensifies under socialism. And in the third part, he adds to this that he disagrees with the notion of class against class, directly battling with capital with no allies or middle ground. The third part is also where he decries the notion of democratic centralism and advocates horizontalism. In addition to these two quotes I supplied from his blog, I can provide evidence I can provide evidence from two other pieces Sims has written, which he himself sent to me as proof that he upholds Marxism-Leninism. Sims stresses, quote, the history of the Communist Party shows an ongoing tension in balancing class and all-class democratic struggles. In other words, Sims sees a contradiction between the class struggle and the all-class democratic struggle. Sims is almost word for word retreading Kautsky. As Lenin said against Kautsky, quote, one cannot help smiling at Kautsky's effort to make it appear that there are people who preach, quote, contempt for democracy and so forth. That is the sort of twaddle that Kautsky uses to befog and confuse. Did I just skip to the issue? No, I didn't. I thought there was overlap. Anyway, to befog and confuse the issue, for he talks like the liberals, speaking of democracy in general and not of bourgeois democracy. Sims, repeating Kautsky's error, totally fails to understand the relationship between the struggle for reforms under bourgeois democracy and how they draw the masses toward the Communist Party and therefore pave the way for the overthrow of bourgeois democracy and replacing it with the deeper, more comprehensive democracy of the dictatorship of the proletariat. There is no such thing as an all-class democracy, which is a liberal fabrication that serves to obscure the nature of the bourgeois dictatorship. In this piece, which I repeat, Sims sent to me as proof of his Marxism-Leninism, Sims goes on to decry the role of the vanguard in educating the masses as, quote, paternalistic. In the other article, and let's just clarify here, because you'll hear this from like anarchists and whatever, people don't believe in a vanguard. The vanguard is just the name of the most class-conscious portion of the working class. Unless you hold the illusion that the entire working class is at the exact same stage of class consciousness, then congrats, you believe that there is a vanguard. That's what it's about. Like some people do spend a lot of time, thinking about class issues, class conflict, class society, reading, theory and history about it, and some don't. Some, in fact, listen to Tucker Carlson and Fox News and shit, other blatant bourgeois ideology. Some people are more class conscious than others. Some workers specifically are more class conscious than others. And anyway, that's the vanguard. So in the other article that Sims sent me, Sims writes, quote, already his Two Tactics, it's a piece by Lenin, in embryonic form, stressed what came to be known as the United Front concept, the absolute necessity of a broad front led by the working class to defeat reaction. Here Lenin resolutely challenged the left posturing of those Marxists who feared an alliance with capitalists against a greater enemy, arguing again and again that the working class must lead the battle for democracy, unquote. Not only is this a flagrant misreading of Lenin's Two Tactics, which was written in the context of pre-bourgeois revolution Russia, when the overthrow of the monarchy had not yet taken place. Therefore, capitalism was still in its ascendant, fighting for the people, quote-unquote, stage. But it is Sims' underhanded attempt to propose a, quote, alliance with capitalists against fascists. In other words, class collaboration with the liberal bourgeoisie against the openly reactionary bourgeoisie, something which I've criticized before. Sims totally contradicts what Lenin actually believed in Two Tactics, which is this, quote, the fact is that not only is no excessive zeal displayed among us with regard to the tasks of insurrection, to the general political slogans, and to the matter of leading the entire popular revolution, but on the contrary, it is backwardness in this very respect that stands out most strikingly, constitutes our weakest spot and a real danger to the movement, which may degenerate, and in some places is degenerating, from one that is revolutionary in deeds into one that is revolutionary only in words. Among the many, many hundreds of organizations, groups, and circles that are conducting the work of the party, you will not find a single one which has not, from its very inception, conducted the kind of everyday work about which the wiseacres of the new Iskra now talk with the air of people who have discovered new truths. On the other hand, you will find only an insignificant percentage of groups and circles that have understood the tasks an armed insurrection entails, which have begun to carry them out, and have realized the necessity of leading the entire popular revolution against Tsarism, the necessity of advancing for that purpose certain definite progressive slogans and no other. End of quote. In addition, On working with the liberal bourgeoisie, Lenin decried them thus, quote, "The experience of alliances, agreements, and blocs with the social reform liberals in the West and with the liberal reformists, or cadets, in the Russian Revolution has convincingly shown that these agreements only blunt the consciousness of the masses, that they do not enhance but weaken the actual significance of the masses' struggle by linking fighters with elements who are least capable of fighting and are most vacillating and treacherous." Unquote. Did I slander Joe Sims by claiming that he does not uphold the dictatorship of the proletariat, class struggle, democratic centralism, and therefore Marxism-Leninism? On the contrary, I believe I represented his ideology accurately. It is Joe who misrepresents his own ideology by rewriting Marxism-Leninism and adapting Leninist slogans to his own liberalism. In fact, in our conversation, he claimed about the dictatorship of the proletariat that, quote, "What I said is that the term is misunderstood." A blatant lie. He said he does not even support it conceptually in his blog. "I have always supported the concept of a working class dictatorship of the state," unquote. Even in his supposed claim to support the dictatorship of the proletariat, Sims exposes his own aversion to it through his dishonest mischaracterization. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not mere working class leadership of the state. It is the destruction of the bourgeois state machinery and its replacement with a proletarian non-state that is a machinery for the majority to repress the minority, as occurred in the Soviet Union and Maoist China, among others. Joe Sims not only slanders me, and I think this is the last part we're going to read. This is about the first third of it, so again, there's more to get into here. Joe Sims not only slanders me by implying that I'm a liar and questioning my motives for joining CPUSA. How could I be acting in bad faith when I not only refrained from cop-jacketing him, but cited his own work in my critique, which he did not even bother to read. But he slanders Lenin by doing to him what Kautsky did to Marx. In every publication from the CPUSA, we see flowery pronouncements about democracy and condemnations of the left sectarianism and overly focusing on class enemies and violent insurrection. However, any worker with even a modicum of integrity can see the current danger during the current uprising in the U.S. isn't coming from the left, but from the right, which seeks rapprochement with the bourgeois parties, collaboration with the state, and mild incremental reforms. That's what I'm always saying. It's like, is the overwhelming problem right now left adventurism? Or is it right opportunism? Obviously right opportunism. Every single Communist Party almost worldwide has been captured by class collaboration, if not outright abandoning of socialism. So clearly that's the problem. In fact, as far as the left adventurism thing, in the United States itself, we just saw massive popular uprisings in the streets, literally the moment that people didn't have to go to work back in 2020 over police violence, like basic civil rights stuff, that comes out of capitalism. The capitalist police repression of the working class, particularly in the racialized hierarchy within the working class, targeting Black Americans the most, hence Black Lives Matter. We just had like millions, tens of millions of people in the streets for that. But again, like any suggestion that we stop like licking the Democratic Party's ass is left adventurism. It's fucking absurd. And, we're in a country where like a third of the population at least wants another party. Like there's so much yearning for something more, not to just keep, quietly following behind the Democratic Party as it leads everyone into like an open mass grave. Things get worse when the Democrats are in power. And that's fairly literal if we look at the COVID response. The U.S. hasn't been in a major world war in a while, but it could be 5 years out. It could be 10 years out at this point. If things with Russia keep going, etc., we don't know. But what would CPUSA do in that case? Would they call for the defeat of one's own government in the imperialist war? Or would they be right there behind the Democratic Party? Well, it seems like they're always behind the Democratic Party. They work with them. They try to get Democrats elected. One of the things that this article goes into, rightly, is talking about the Comintern's policies about fighting Nazism and fascism back in the 1930s. How was that to be done? And they say that basically if you're in a very backward country where the proletariat isn't very advanced and not large in numbers, then your proletariat needs to lead, but probably should make an alliance with the petty bourgeoisie and other non-proletarian elements. But in a more advanced country like England or something, the proletariat's big enough to just do the thing themselves. And that's the point. We're talking about 2022 USA. By the way, you can find that. I have a playlist up on the channel. I'll link to it as well, but I would like to mention its name. It's called Understanding Fascism plus Right-Wing Social Political Movements from a Marxist, Socialist, Communist Perspective. It has many videos in it, 66 videos. Lenin, Gramsci, Clara Zetkin, who else is in here? There's one from Bukharin, Dimitrov, Michael Parenti, Anuradha Gandhi, and other people writing about right-wing politics, fascism specifically, reactionary like neo-feudalist movements and things like that, and the capitalist class's relationship with them. You know, the capitalists start out progressive, they're overthrowing feudalism. But then as they see their task looming before them of creating this proletariat, which they have to exploit, they then anchor themselves in the overthrown reaction to keep things from moving into socialism. So anyway, you know, this is where we're at in 2022. We have a gigantic proletariat. We don't even need an alliance so much with the bourgeoisie, petty bourgeoisie. We could go it alone. We have the numbers, etc. What's lacking is the class consciousness, the education, the organization to just up and do the thing. But the numbers, we're 9 out of 10 people in the population in the United States. It's not even close. All right, anyway. During times of upheaval, the main danger is from the right, continuing the article here, and during lulls, the main danger is from the left. Yet Sims and his cohorts only have words to say for the, quote, ultra-lefts, who advocate organizing and arming the workers against the fascists and their liberal bourgeois collaborators. Thank you, they are collaborators. On the other hand, they have quite pleasant things to say about Biden and Harris, two liberals who have worked hand in glove with the most reactionary forces in the country. But we will delve into that and CPUSA's tireless effort to conceal their party line in a moment. So like I said, I'll link to that. Good work again. It's a blog I like a lot. And I encourage you all to read the other 60% of that article or so. We're going to wrap it up here with me checking in with the chat and just sort of catching up on comments. Again, still on the agenda is Wolff, Richard Wolff, and the whole Reagan thing I was mentioning before. I'll see if I can dig up that article. I feel like I didn't delete it, but having a hard time finding it. And then also the stuff about COVID. We'll probably do another stream this week and get into that. So I guess this is solving the question of 2 or 3 streams per week. And I really wish I could stop hitting that desk handle. Anyway, let's get into the comments, and then we will call it a day. Thanks to everybody for being here, by the way. All right. Imperialism is always a thing, even without the U.S., somebody says. And the next comment is exactly what I would have said. The U.S. is a major factor that keeps it in place. That's what I'm saying is the U.S. is like the heart of global, like the force that is required to keep empire in place. Not just militarily, but economically and basically every other way. It would collapse without the U.S. Therefore, what I'm trying to say is that capitalists will make sure to try to preserve that. Even if they lose Greece, if they lose Portugal, even if they lose like whoever else, they're going to try to keep the U.S. That's where, like, basically they understand that their survival means keeping the U.S. in the thing. And I have to assume that that's going to be their top priority. So that's the meaning. It's going to be the most difficult thing. If the USA were gone overnight, someone else would slip into the imperialist role. Someone is trying right now. Yes, but that would require building up capitalism. Like, so you're trying to say that the imperialists who already are investing in Russia and are also investing in China are, you know, like Russia's a potential, if the U.S. were to stop doing what's basically in its DNA, they could reorganize global imperialism around using Russia as the major bully. Theoretically, Russia has never been in that role. I don't know. I mean, that would take some time, and it would leave them in a long, vulnerable period to make that transition. You're technically right, but we also live within the limits of what is practical in a world dominated by, you know, space and time. and or separated by space and time. The fact is it does take time to build that up and to move resources and things. So it would be a period of major vulnerability for them. Of course, they would like to avoid that. Who the fuck votes to keep these right-wingers in charge of the Communist Party? I think you speak for many when you ask that question. Your thoughts and ideas do not matter in this society unless they're profitable or if a rich person dubs it to be. Correct, you are in the right place. So yeah, somebody from CPUSA talk about what do you see going on with these elections? Are there attempts to recall these leaders? Are there real challenges to their power? What's going on with that? You know, people are always asking me. As I mentioned in the last stream, I think that this is something the community. I'm happy to help facilitate the conversation, but I'd really like to see the community discussing more. So, please do. Yeah, I agree with the other comment here. No one could fill the USA's role right now, but I think as the US collapses, we may see Europe get more and more militarized. Well, because Europe is part of this thing. Obviously, the European bourgeoisie does, without the USA being the enforcer around the world, the European bourgeoisie would really be hard pressed to do their own military and all that kind of stuff. And that would be a huge point of vulnerability. So they do have an interest in the USA staying in its role, or if the US doesn't, in finding somebody else to do. But who are we kidding? The USA, of course, is going to keep trying to do that with everything that they have. By the way, KKE has some backward social views comparable to cockshot, like homophobia, just saying that's there to critique. I haven't come across it yet, and when we do, I'm sure we will. It's nice to have at least a few good examples on foreign policy from a communist perspective. Again, I think that what we'd like to see is the unsticking and the unfreezing, an updating of ideological struggle again in all of these parties, and if the parties don't prove to be suitable vehicles, then to make new parties. But yeah. Germany is already remilitarizing. Military-industrial complex would move their operations overseas right quick if the states collapse. The thing is that the United States already is in, there's hundreds of military bases around the world, and I honestly, creating that kind of presence under another flag, I mean, it would just be so, what do you do with that? I mean, unless you're talking about they would just reclaim the bases and, fly another flag over it. But you're talking about a major, major undertaking. No doubt, I think imperialism would be much easier to defeat with, the European bourgeoisie trying to raise their own armies to do their own fighting again. No doubt, would love to see that. But I do think they would fight to keep their weapon, their muscle, the USA in place, as they have been doing. It's not like keeping the USA in that position is some new effort. They've been keeping it there by all means necessary for a long time. Well, people may have left the stream. I mean, some 20 people did. There's still 32 people here, which is more than we've had in a lot of the earlier streams prior to number 40. So it's fine. They can catch it on YouTube. Yeah, so here's another point about Sims that seems logical to me. The fact that someone like Joe Sims got so far up in the party and for so long is a massive red flag, the bad kind, about what is going on in that party. This is an issue I have raised with enthusiastic CPUSA members who defend the leadership. And I've gotten it both ways. Some people say, no, he's not representative of the way that the party thinks. And I'm like, well, then your election processes are completely broken, just logically speaking. Or they say, no, he is representative of the party. And then I'm like, well, then your party is very opportunist and revisionist then. And then they just started arguing with me. But not on the facts. So anyway, yeah, we're definitely getting into more statements from socialist parties and things like that here on the stream. I do think it's important. you know, we've been doing this for about 2.5 years, so we're kind of still finding the rhythm. I think we'll be improving this whole thing up to year 5 or 6 at least before everything's like all figured out. All right, and we're about caught up. What do I think of Politsturm? I like most of what I've seen. They are friendly with other people who I generally like. So that's basically what I think of Politsturm. In fact, again, I haven't watched every one of their videos, but they do have a recommended reading list, and I do have a playlist of Politsturm's reading lists. I don't have everything on it yet. I think I've got about 2/3 of it done, and then some of the holes patched with other people's, like Finball's Marxist-Leninist Theory channel, the computer audiobooks. Eventually, we'll be doing them all. But yeah, pretty good from what I've seen. All right, well, I think we're going to pick this up again probably tomorrow, if not then on Saturday. But thanks to everybody for coming into the stream, and thanks to everybody listening on YouTube. Again, you really help to make this what it is. Without further ado, we're going to sign off and expect more content, not just streams, but also we are doing those Jason Hinkman and Jimmy Dore reaction videos, some old school hanging with the PatSocs gang stuff for this weekend, as well as audiobooks.